Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Erica, and I am a yoga, mindfulness, and anxiety coach. And today we're going to be exploring downward facing dog. So, downward facing dog is also known as Adho Mukha Svanasana, which means Adho, down, Mukha, face, Svan or Svana is dog, and Asana is pose. Downward facing dog is one of those foundational poses in yoga. It's one of those poses that, especially if you practice vinyasa, you're going to be using a lot. So it makes sense that we want to really know this asana super well so that we can understand it, understand what's happening, the mechanics of it in our body, and also know that if we cannot get into the full expression of the pose, there are many modifications and there are props that we can use to help you get into the pose and then hopefully work your way toward the full expression of the pose. So let's get into Adho Mukha Svanasana. I'm going to go into the full expression of the pose and I'm going to show you how to get there safely. So firstly, you're going to start in a tabletop position. So your tabletop position, your fingers are stretched out. All four corners of your hands are on the mat. Your wrists are directly underneath your shoulders and your knees are directly underneath your hips. Your elbow joint, the inside crease, is facing inwards. So they are facing towards one another. From this position, I'd like you to engage your core. So really feel your belly button drawing towards your spine so that your core engages. And then think of lifting out of your shoulder girdle. So just sit in your shoulder girdle, let your shoulders sort of slump down, and then bring yourself to a point where you've really engaged that shoulder girdle and lifted your shoulders. Now you're in a good position to get into your downward facing dog. So you're going to tuck your toes and you're going to lift your hips up towards the sky and start to straighten your legs as you start to draw the weight away from your wrists and to flatten your back. So the energy in your downward facing dog is moving from your fingers, from your wrists, going all the way up your arms, up your back, and then down your gluteal group, down your hamstrings, down your calf muscles, and through into the floor through your heels. So this is the full expression. You can see in this pose, you're strengthening your hands, your fingers, all those intrinsic muscles of the hands. You're strengthening your wrists. You're strengthening your arm muscles. You're strengthening the sides of your back. You're strengthening your core. And then you're stretching into the lower back. You're stretching into the whole back, in fact. You're stretching into the glutes. You're stretching into the hamstrings, the calf muscles, and you're even stretching a little bit into that Achilles tendon. So that's what's happening in your downward facing dog. It really is a full body stretch and strengthen. And you can understand why it's one of those foundational poses in yoga. It can be very restorative, very relaxing, and it brings a lot of balance to the body. It can also, it's considered an inversion because your head is below your heart. So it also is obviously very good for you in that way. And so the thing with downward facing dog is that sometimes when you first start practicing yoga, you want to go into the full expression of the pose, but you might have weak wrists, which is a very common thing when you first start practicing yoga, or you might have shorter hamstrings. So if any of those things are a problem for you, you are going to struggle to get into the full expression of the pose, but it doesn't mean that you can't practice the pose. The only contraindications for downward facing dog are if you have very high blood pressure. It's recommended that you speak to your medical provider first because it can be practiced if you have high blood pressure that is well controlled. So that would be something you'd need to speak to your medical provider with first before you go into downward facing dog. Other contraindications are if you've recently had surgery or you have recent injuries in your wrists, in your hands, in your shoulders, in your hips, in your knees, in your ankles, anywhere like that, then you shouldn't be practicing Adho Mukha Svanasana. But once you are recovered and you are strengthening, then it can be a wonderful pose for you to do. So I'm going to show you some of the modifications that you can do in downward facing dog if you are feeling it somewhere in your body. So let's start from the hands and the wrists. A lot of the times your wrists, when you start practicing yoga, feel a little bit of pain because they're not quite strong enough. And for many people, you just don't have very strong wrists, and that's okay. So the way that you can modify downward facing dog for your wrists and for your hands is by holding. First of all, you'll come into your tabletop position, and then you will hold the outside of your mat. As you hold the outside of your mat, you'll then tuck your toes and you'll push yourself into your downward facing dog. Now, as you can see, by holding onto the mat, I'm now activating my wrist muscles. So that can be a good way to get into your downward facing dog if your wrists are weak, and it's a good way of strengthening your wrists. Another thing that you can do is use props. So yoga blocks are fantastic in yoga practice in general. So if you place it on the lowest level and place the blocks at the distance just where your hands would be in your tabletop position. So you'll go into your tabletop just as you did before, but your hands will go onto the blocks and your fingers are nice and open, stretched, and your wrist is in line with the base of that block. So once you're there, same thing, engage in your abdominals, draw your shoulder girdle up, and then tuck your toes, and then pushing down into the heels of your hands. You're then going to go into your downward facing dog. And that helps to relieve some of the pressure off of your wrists. So those are two modifications that you can do if you have weak wrists. If you have a weak shoulder girdle, or if you're recovering from a shoulder injury and your shoulders are still a little bit weak, you can go into your downward facing dog with your hands a little bit apart, so not quite where they were. They're not quite shoulder width apart, a little bit more, and then turn your fingertips towards each other at an angle. So you're opening up that shoulder area and then turning your hands, going into the position that way. That can help to maybe relieve some of the pressure off of your shoulders. Now, if this is still too much for you in your shoulder girdle or too much for you in your wrists, there is a great alternative posture for you, and that is the puppy pose. So the puppy pose has pretty much very similar benefits as Adho Mukha Svanasana, but obviously you're not stretching your legs, so you won't be getting the stretch in your legs. But it does really help to like lengthen that back and to take pressure off of the wrists and to not work so much into the shoulder girdle. So the puppy pose, you'll start in the same way. You'll be in your tabletop position. Then you're going to walk your hands forward about a foot in front of you. And once you're there, you're gently going to keeping your hips up in the air. You're going to gently release your chest down towards the ground and either place your forehead on the ground or place your chin. Now, that could also feel a little bit too much for you if you have issues with your shoulders. So back off a little bit and keep your forehead down, or take a block and place a block by your forehead just to keep yourself raised so that you're not curling too much and putting any extra strain on your shoulders. So that's a nice alternative pose for downward facing dog. Now, if you have very tight hamstrings, it is a very common thing to have tight hamstrings because many of us work at a desk all day and that shortens your hamstrings. So the most important thing to remember with downward facing dog is that it is better to have a flat back than to have straight legs. So this is what I see very often with my students. They'll go into their downward facing dog, but because they have very tight hamstrings, as soon as they start to stretch their legs, that's what happens. Their spine curls. Now, the quickest and easiest thing to do is to bend your knees in your downward facing dog. Give them a good bend. And what this does is then it gives you that space to be able to draw the weight away from your wrists and draw your shoulder girdle towards your thighs. So that for me is a much better pose than stretching your legs and having a curled spine. And I always suggest to even seasoned yogis that your first downward facing dog have bent knees, because it just allows your lower back to get a nice stretch without putting too much strain on your hamstrings straight away. Now, another thing that I also find is that some people are very, very flexible and some people are a little bit too flexible in their spines. So they'll tend to overarch their spine. Now, if you're one of those people who has a very stretchy spine and you tend to overarch your spine, just drawing your belly button towards your spine and closing your rib cage. So feel your rib cage closing, feel your belly button drawing towards your spine. That'll help you to not over arch your spine and over index. All right, so that is your downward facing dog. Another thing, if you are feeling like your heels, sometimes your Achilles tendon is quite short. And even if you've got a nice flat back, you've got nice straight legs, you just can't get your heels down to the ground. Or you might have very short calf muscles. Something that's quite nice to also do is to take a blanket, a rolled up blanket, and then come into your tabletop as you did and place your heels down onto the rolled up blanket. You might need to roll it a couple of times to lift it even higher, but that's really nice because it just allows your heels to release down completely and it allows you to relax further into the asana. So yeah, those are all the modifications when it comes to downward facing dog. And I really urge you to use them. You know, we go through different phases in our lives where one phase you can go into the pose, no problem, stretched legs, nice flat back, heels down on the ground. But then something might happen. You might have an injury, or you might, a pregnancy is a big one. You know, after pregnancy, I was really, really stiff and not limbered at all. So I had to really use props and use modifications. Rather use modifications and go safely and correctly into an asana and work your way towards the full pose, then trying to go straight into the full pose and then not having the correct alignment and not doing it as well as you could be doing it from the beginning. So that's Adho Mukha Svanasana. Please check back for more yoga basics videos. I'm going to be putting as many as possible just to break down and explore as many yoga asanas as possible. If you enjoy these videos and you're enjoying my channel, I would love it if you could subscribe. It really helps to support me and it also helps you to not miss any videos that I post. Thanks so much. Bye.